Hey, everybody. I want to say, first of all, I hope too many of you didn't do the lesson on seamstress for this week. I apologize for that. I wrote these things out of order, and I couldn't remember what was next. Anyway, it's so good to see all of you. Thanks for coming out on this sort of foggy day. And we're going to jump right into this topic of wisdom. I want you to think, and you have been thinking for the last hour at least, and maybe for the week, when you think about wisdom, what do you think of? You probably think of words like knowledge, instruction, good sense, sound judgment, understanding, discernment, maybe even a mental or moral quality that you can receive that will help you make good decisions and know right and wrong. And these are all very similar ways of describing something that God gives us. We get our wisdom from God, right? Over time, usually. I learned a little bit about just the word itself. It actually is hokmah. I'm not sure how you say it, but it means to separate. And it actually can be used to describe the way that cheese is made. But also it's used in the idea of creation, right? God separated the waters. And it's also used in the way that we think of wisdom, the separating and understanding of good and evil. But it's so much more, as some of you may have discovered as you dug into it this week. I was very surprised at some of the things I learned. And I'm going to talk about wisdom from two standpoints. The first one is wisdom's connection to life and death. It is literally a matter of life and death. When we see in the Proverbs that we looked at this week, and also in some of the other wisdom literature, which includes Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, we can learn, first of all, we learned this week about Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. So I'm going to, in this first section about wisdom's connection to life and death, I'm going to make 5 different contrasts. And the first one you see is Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. They actually represent 2 paths, the path to life and the path to death. They're very different, but they do a lot of similar things. They both are all over the place, calling out to people, inviting people into their home to have drink and food, promoting their way. Lady Wisdom promotes things like knowing right and wrong, having good values, having strong families and communities, knowing how to manage money, the importance of having integrity, the power of your words and of speech, and how to talk to your children about important things like this. Lady Folly promotes forbidden pleasure. I think she also promotes another thing that's not specifically named, but she promotes the notion that there are no consequences for the choice that you make. I also want to add that's not the only kind of things that Lady Folly can do, this sexuality and this pleasure and all these things that she talks about. There's a lot of other ways that we can reject wisdom and be on the path to death than just that. But that's just the tool that Solomon used, this idea of forbidden pleasure. So that's our first contrast, Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. Something very obviously not wisdom, right? The next one is actually a throwback to Genesis 3. We see in Proverbs 3 that Lady Wisdom is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. You know from Genesis that the tree of life was in the Garden of Eden. It really represents God. Be with me, eat of me, and you will have life. And the counterpoint, just like Lady Wisdom has a counterpoint of Lady Folly, there's this opposite tree of knowledge and good and evil. But what it promises is very slippery. You remember that the serpent came to Eve and said, what did God say about what you could eat, which trees you could eat from? And she said, well, we can eat from all of them, except this one. And if we eat of it or even touch it, we're going to die. And the serpent said, you surely will not die. God knows that it will make you wise like him, knowing good and evil. There's no consequence. God said this, but I'm telling you that's not true. You're not going to have a consequence. He's offering actually wisdom. You'll be like God if you have this, and you will know good and evil. So when Eve saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom, she ate it. That tree promised wisdom, but gave death. So we've got that same kind of contrast as we see with with Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, that there's these results, right, that are going to happen. And this is a contrast between true wisdom, and which is God, and the enemy, which is just lies, right? A third contrast that I want to talk to you about is, I'm just going to lay this here, in Job. So Job, you may remember, is a man who's in deep, deep, deep grief. He's lost all of his children. He's lost all of his livestock. He's been left with his wife and his 3 friends who are not very much encouragement to him. And he's in the middle of a conversation with the friends who are blaming him for his situation. And back and forth they go, back and forth. And in chapter 28, he starts talking about the weirdest thing. He starts talking about mining, about how there are these things that are hidden in the earth. Gold, silver, iron, jewels, hidden in the earth, that no man has seen them, no animal has seen them, no foot has trod where they are. But man can dig a tunnel into the mountain and find this thing that's hidden and bring it to light. And yet, man cannot find wisdom. Where is wisdom? Where does wisdom live? Where does understanding dwell? And he goes and he asks death and destruction, where does wisdom dwell? And death and destruction say, well, we don't even know if that's for sure there is wisdom. We've heard a rumor about wisdom, but we don't know. And of course, that makes sense, right? Death and destruction are at the exact opposite end of where wisdom is. They will never have seen wisdom, right? So Job concludes that only God knows where wisdom is, and that God himself, when he was establishing the wind and measuring out the waters, he looked at wisdom. He declared it, he prepared it, and he searched it out. And then he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. So we have a contrast of the Proverbs Lady Wisdom, who's loud and out there and accessible, and everywhere you look, there she is, on the street corners and over at the gates and on the high places and the low places. She's there, right there. But wisdom is not that for Job. He's like, where is wisdom? I can't find it, or her. I suspect that this person who's in deep grief is looking for relief and answers to questions that have no answers, right? One of the big questions that's asked constantly whenever we have anything go wrong, but especially in grief, is why? Why? I cannot understand why. So we're looking for this understanding. And his friends are giving them all kinds of their wisdom, which is not truth even. And then God taps him on the shoulder and says, he doesn't say, here's why. He says, where were you when I was creating the world? Where were you when I was building the storehouses for snow? It's a very creative way of talking about creation, right? Building storehouses for snow. And Job instantly, in God's presence, and in this reference to God and who he is, his sovereignty, realizes that he has been really seeking his own understanding, right? I'm looking for the answers that I want, which may or may not actually be wisdom, right? And he says, I didn't know what I was talking about, and I'm going to shut my mouth, which is actually a really good evidence of wisdom sometimes, when we say, I'm going to shut up now. Our fourth contrast is Solomon. So Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he writes about wisdom there too. He was a king who God had said, I want to give you a gift. What do you want? And he said wisdom, which actually sort of takes wisdom to ask for. And God was so happy that he had asked for this that he said, I'm going to give you that and more. So this is a man who has been gifted the wisdom of God straight from God. And yet, he goes on to tell his story. He tells all these chapters where he said, I searched for wisdom with my ability to do this, and I built things, and I read things, and I met people, and I got married 1,000 times, and I was just trying to find wisdom, he says, in all of that. That's what he was doing, trying to find wisdom. Okay, this is a guy who already has wisdom from God, right, hand delivered to him, right? And then he summarizes the beginning of the book. All is vanity. In much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. In chapter 7, he says, I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. I found something more bitter than death, a woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are chains. I'm wondering if this is possibly a case of mistaken identity. He thought he was seeking after following Lady Wisdom, but he was actually cozying up to Lady Folly. He did eventually come full circle. He ended the book by saying, this is my advice, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In other words, set this foundation before you go and ruin your life of God. So here we have a contrast of God's wisdom, the one that he gave him directly, pure God's wisdom, with what you might call the world's wisdom, intellect, success, those kinds of things, acclaim even maybe. And then the last contrast comes from James 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good conduct, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast in it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and even demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder. Kind of want you to remember that word, disorder, and every evil practice. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, peace-loving, gentle, accommodating, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. So here we can see that there's a contrast between the wisdom from above, heavenly, from God, and the wisdom that is from below. It's just straight out demonic, right? And we also see that we can tell by our fruits which kind of wisdom that we are leaning into. All of these contrasts are very similar to each other and nothing new. But I do think it highlights the fact that in our search for wisdom, there are going to be counterfeits out there. And it sometimes can be very hard to tell the difference. We can look in the wrong places and end up lured by folly, by something demonic. Because remember, Satan can appear as an angel of light. That's from 2 Corinthians 11. Paradoxically, it does seem that it takes wisdom to even be able to know how to recognize and distinguish between wisdom and all its counterfeits. So I think it goes back because it does require wisdom in order to recognize how to choose wisdom, that Solomon and Job were right when they said the answer lies in God himself. Wisdom is a key aspect of who God is. It's not just something he gives us, but it's who he is. And like Eve, we get in trouble in the way that we hope to find it, maybe the places we look for it, and maybe even in the way we think about it. If we only think about it as this thing that is given to us and it's a blessing that will help us, that's not bad. He tells us to search for it, and he tells us why we should. But I think there's more, and that leads me into my second point. Wisdom's connection to creation. So I want to talk a little bit about Lady Wisdom, and I want you to know there's a lot of speculation about who she is. And I'm not going to give you any definitive answers, but I do want you to think about it and just pray about it and maybe study a little bit more to come to your own conclusions about her. But one thing that people say is that she's not a real person. She's not a real being. She's simply a literary device called personification that's in a book of poetry that we read differently than we might read a book of law, right? It's poetry. It's just a way of bringing to life an idea. I just read from Job about death and destruction, right? Those were personifications. You yourself are familiar with this. How many of you have named your car? Ah, there's one. I knew it'd be you. I know a lot of people that name their car or their guitar or their piano. I know that sailors ever since there have been sailors, called their ships a she. So it isn't an unusual idea to take an idea and make it into a person. Now, some people believe that Lady Wisdom is an Egyptian goddess of wisdom who was the wife of God. Yes. Yes. Some people believe that Lady Wisdom's name is Sophia. And I've heard of Sophia, but I never knew exactly who are they talking about. I've never seen Sophia in the Bible. What is this about? And it's really just the transliteration, which is not taking a word and translating it into another language. It's taking each letter and taking that letter to match this letter and that letter to match, doing that with the word, and it just makes another word that means wisdom. Sophie, that's what happens when you transliterate the Hebrew word wisdom into Greek. It's the word Sophie or Sophia. So is it somebody's name? I don't know. Some people believe that Lady Wisdom is the Holy Spirit, or at least an early iteration of her. They get this because the word spirit and the word wisdom are both called feminine words. But as we talked about earlier in another lesson, the gender of a word does not always mean that the gender is assigned to the object. So that's very thin reason to say that the Holy Spirit is wisdom, Lady Wisdom. But they both do the same things. So this could be a reason why it could make sense. They both interact with us directly. They comfort, they guide, they instruct, they transform, they empower us. The Spirit has strong connection to wisdom in that the Spirit can give an impartation of wisdom to somebody, just like other gifts like prophecy and healing and faith. And lastly, some people believe that Lady Wisdom is Jesus. And they think this because of Jesus's and Lady Wisdom's role in creation. We know from John 1:1, there's a very strong connection there to creation when John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And we know that that is talking about Jesus. We know from Colossians 1:15 that Jesus is the firstborn of creation, and by him all things were created. As the Word, it's very likely that he was the one who said, "Let there be light." He's an expression of God, an extension of God. He embodies God as God's Word, God's voice. He was there at the beginning. He's the firstborn of creation. And interestingly enough, that is what Lady Wisdom says about herself too. So you probably read this passage in your class today, Proverbs 8:22 through 31. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time in it. She starts out with, "The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works." There it is, brought me forth, which is like a birth imagery, as the first of his works. Before his deeds of old, I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. 3 times there, or really 4 if you count that she was formed. There's this idea of where she might have come from. She goes on then to describe basically day 1 of creation, where the waters were separated, the dry land was formed, the waters were kept back from the edges of just to the edges of the dry land. You had the clouds, you had the sky, the hills. So it's just basically the earth was being created. And when God was doing all that, he was creating order out of something that had no form. when we talked about from James 3 that when we operate under this demonic wisdom, it creates disorder. Well, that's just Satan trying to undo what God was doing with creation. The connections are just everywhere. I love that. But my favorite part of this is the last two things she has to say. She says, and then I was at his side. Now, some versions say constantly at his side. Some say daily at his side. But the real meaning here seems to be I was a skilled artisan or master craftsman or a little child raised at his side. And there again, we have that concept of him having created an expression of himself that was him, fully God, but apart from him, fulfilling a specific role. My favorite part, though, is where she says, I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. This is the part that made me start to think differently about how I think of wisdom. First of all, think about wisdom as a little girl. And she's this expression of this key aspect of God, wisdom. And you had a lot of good conversations, I'm sure, in your groups about the importance of wisdom in creating everything so that it all worked together just as it does. And all you have to do is look at the cosmos, planets, all of that to just be blown away. Or just look at the human eye, right? Just the wisdom, the knowledge, the craftsmanship involved in all of that. But I'm amazed to think beyond just these words of knowledge and instruction and discernment. And I love the fact that we can add to our definition of wisdom words like enjoyment, creativity, delight, rejoicing in creating something for us, and thinking about how much we would love it. When I think about creation sometimes, I do picture it as a dark place, and God just says some words and maybe does this, and maybe there's some Disney, sparkly things. But he's not right in the middle of it, right? That's how I used to see it. He's apart from it. But then when you look at, and that when you read Genesis, the count of Genesis, or even what I was reading just now in Proverbs, it's just very cut and dried. It's not very poetic. But when you read it in Job, or when you read it in Psalm 104, you start to see that he was so much more involved. And I love thinking about a little girl. I have 2 girls and a boy, and I can't say that I did much creating with my boy. Maybe we built some towers that he could knock over with his cars. But the girls, the art, I can't even tell you the books of art we have. The painting, the drawing, the coloring, the rooms we decorated. Everywhere we moved, they had to have a new, different kind of room. The parties, the birthday parties. He didn't care what his birthday party was like, but they had like a theme and the whole thing, right? The dresses, the colors that they love. I think it was Kim Gilmore who was talking about 8 crayons is great until you see the box of 64. That's what we're talking about here, this love of creating, right? And a little girl, I can just imagine her loving every bit of it and laughing. And now that can be some drama, I know. They can cry easily. But I can just picture God going, what do you think this animal should have on it? Well, let's put some spots, some big spots, kind of crooked spots, not like perfect polka dots. Well, what else do you think we need? What if we stretched its neck super high above all the other animals, and then he can look down on everybody, and he can eat out of the tree, and there you have a giraffe, right? Why not? When you're thinking about a little girl who then grew up to be Lady Wisdom, right? And she talks so much about delight and rejoicing. I believe in the Passion, it even uses the word play. So I wanted to, as I was thinking about God and the way that he created and the way that we create, well, if you're a baker, if you're a seamstress, if you're an artist or a writer or a potter, you when you create something, you're very much involved, right? You buy the tools, you look at the plan that you're going to follow, the recipe or the whatever it is. You spend time getting in there. Let's just use baking, for example. You are stirring, you're pouring, you're tasting. You're like, oh, it needs a little more of this, a little more of that. The whole time you're thinking about, I cannot wait to see what they think about this pie. I think they're going to love it. I can't wait to see the look on their face when I present this pie. And anybody who creates anything is really doing that. And I really do like the idea of thinking about God as a potter. And he uses that imagery for himself to describe his making of us. A potter does not just stand over here and kind of do something, from a distance. A potter wraps his legs around the wheel, brings it in close to his body or her body, and throws some water, gets it running, just starts with a little light, kind of, holding it, pushing a little bit of this and that, and starts thinking about, what am I going to make? Am I going to make a bowl? Am I going to make a pitcher? What colors will I use? And I've been told that they can sometimes tell the clay has a thing it wants to be, which fits with us, doesn't it? As the clay. And so then the potter is getting messy. The water is splashing and the clay is splashing on them. And they are pulling and pushing and shaping. They're intimately involved in the creation individually of each piece of pottery. And I think that is amazing to think about God that way versus just standing over creation and going, let there be that, and, no, there's obviously thought in it. There's wisdom in it. But I like the idea of thinking of him very intimately involved, the way we create. And maybe that's why we create that way, because that's the way he creates. And we do get a sense of that in Psalms 104. And I want to just scroll down a little bit through it. It starts out with just the language he's using here. Oh, Lord, my God, you're so great. You're clothed with honor and majesty. You cover yourself with light as with a garment. You stretch out the heavens like a curtain. You lay the beam of your upper chambers in the water. You scroll down to 6. You covered the earth. You covered it deep. Let's see, what is it? You laid the foundations of the earth and covered them deep with a garment, as with a garment. Excuse me. The waters stood above the mountains, and at your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away and went up over the mountains and down into the valleys. You set a boundary that they could not pass over. You send springs into the valleys to flow into the hills and give drink to every beast, to quench their thirst. You water the hills. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine that makes glad the heart of man. Oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen his heart. Goes on and on, but down in verse 24, O Lord, how manifold, how many different kinds of variety are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. The sea is teeming with innumerable things. Down to 31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the hills and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. May my meditation be sweet to him. I will be glad in the Lord. May sinners be consumed from the earth and the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. I think that what I'm really coming to see is that wisdom is not just a thing that God gives us. He does do all that, and he does it to protect us because he loves us and doesn't want us to ruin our lives, and he wants us to have what the world calls your best life. You've heard that, right? People talking about living your best life. This is truly that. When the world says that, they may just mean having fun and, things going your way, making a lot of money, but when God says that, he's talking about truly your best life. And I think the amazing thing that I am understanding is that as we abide in God's presence, he is wisdom. And we are exposed to his wisdom just by being in his presence. We're exposed to his wisdom just by being in his word. When we bask in the delight of him and sing his praises, we delight in his world, and we delight in each other, just like wisdom and God did, then I think we are as close as we can be to the source of wisdom. And I can't think of a better way to search and seek for wisdom than that. Because anywhere we start trying to search and seek for wisdom that's not that, we are at risk of being fooled by the counterfeits. Wisdom is all the things that we think it is, but it's also awe and wonder and delight. And the more that we experience that directly from God, the more wisdom will shape us to want the things that are good for us and that bring life. Right? We can say, I know I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to do this. And it's a struggle. It's true, it is. But I believe wisdom is shaping us to want the right things, to desire the right things. And that only comes when we're just dwelling in the presence of God and his word. All the things that we might seek out as that we think is wisdom, worldly wisdom. We want to avoid, of course, demonic wisdom, and we want to avoid anything that's satanic, all of those things. But we can still get caught up in the wrong kind of wisdom if we're not careful. And as you know from this week's lesson, this is the greatest thing there is for you to seek out. It's better than all the jewels, all the silver, all the gold. There's nothing better for you. And it's just God. It's just God. That's all.